Hello, and welcome to this slightly late starting event in celebration of Independent Bookshop Week and Pride Month. Carmen Maria Machado in conversation with Zoe Mayer. I'm Sam from Burley Fisher Books. For those of you who are yet to visit us, we are an independent bookshop in Haggerston in East London, selling new and used books, but with a special focus on indie presses. This week, we are celebrating both Independent Bookshop Week and Pride by partnering with Serpent's Tale, who are, I suppose, a spiritual sibling of the shop. And aside from tonight's event, we've got loads of other interesting stuff happening as part of the celebration, which we've outlined in a blog on our website, which we'll link in the comments. I want to give a special thanks to Flora and Drew at Serpent's Tale for all of their hard work in putting together this event and also everything else that's happening this week in celebration of Independent Bookshop Week. And now, before we get onto the event, since we've opened, live events have been incredibly important to us, which is why I wanted to tell you a little bit about a festival we're planning in October, both to celebrate 5 years since we opened and to highlight some of the fantastic indie presses we've worked with in that time. We'll be holding 2 days of events and workshops in St. Peter's Church in Beauvoir, which is just a 5-minute walk from the shop, on subjects as varied as the new essay and queer London fictions. The lineup will be announced soon, but we're currently selling discounted early bird passes for only £30 for the entire weekend. Again, we'll link this in the comments. But on to this evening's event. To explain the format, our 2 speakers will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions. Please do post your questions in the comments section, as I've seen that you already have been, so thank you very much for that. On YouTube as they occur to you, as we'll be monitoring them throughout. And so we'll put them to Carmen in the Q&A at the end. Carmen Maria Machado is the winner of the 2021 Rathbones Folio Prize for her book In the Dream House, and has been a finalist for the National Book Award and the winner of the Bard Fiction Prize, the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Fiction, the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ Nonfiction, the Brooklyn Public Library Literature Prize, the Shirley Jackson Award, and the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize. In The Observer, Joanna Thomas Core called In the Greenhouse a tender, incandescent memoir like no other, while Daisy Johnson says that Machado is sublime. Is a sublime, phenomenal, breathtakingly good writer, and a new work by her is a momentous occasion. Sorry for that, Daisy. Stumbling through your quote. In conversation with Carmen tonight is Zoe Mayer, author of, most recently, A Nazi Word for a Nazi Thing, an essay published by Peninsula Press, described by Eileen Miles as a small revolution that becomes a party you won't be leaving soon. Zoe is a bookseller at Burley Fisher, a curator with queer feminist film collective Club de Femmes, and co-founder of Raising Films, a campaign and community for parents and carers in the film industry. Before I disappear, I want to give you, I've got to do this as a bookseller, obviously. I want to give you one final reminder that we're offering a 10% discount if you order both of Carmen's titles. So if you already got them, it's a perfect opportunity to order them for a friend. We'll link this offer in the comments. Now, please welcome Carmen and Zoe.
I just want to say these books are a gift. Buy them, gift them to yourself, gift them to others. If you hear a faint noise during this conversation, it's inner teenage baby queer me squealing that this is happening and these books exist and we get to talk about them. So, Carmen, thank you across time. And in that teenage spirit, I've been writing down the sentences from your work that I would have scrawled on my backpack. And the campaign for the t-shirts begins here. So please, fans, add your quotes to the chat. We'll see which one's the most popular and we'll get Serpent's Tale on it. And so a couple of mine, you were all mind. Anxiety was your lifeblood, your fuel. Probably a useful t-shirt to wear some days. I broke the stories down because I was breaking down and didn't know what else to do. And perhaps a more one that's reaching out of the darkness, the necessary sacredness of private space, of the body, of the mind. Carmen, I want to start by asking, what are some of yours, like some of the lines that you go back to? Because every sentence is so perfectly constructed, but are there some that you still feel inside you and you're carrying into your new work?
Oh, that's so fun. It's such a funny question. I mean, it's weird because in some ways I feel like when I finish a book, it sort of leaves me in this really interesting way. And the only times that I feel like something still exists inside of me is if I'm doing, readings. So like actually when this book came out in the US in fall 2019, so before COVID, and I was touring kind of nonstop, and I was reading sort of the same sets of pieces over and over, and there were certain parts that I got kind of under my skin. I mean, at some point I had basically memorized like the Bluebeard chapter, and I would sometimes just like find myself reciting pieces of it because I just had read it so many times. I was pretty sure I could read it from memory at that point. I never tried, but I was pretty sure I could. So yeah, no, but it's weird because it does feel like once I create something and I've committed it to the page and I've edited it and it's gone through all that process, like it feels like not like a part of me anymore. It actually feels really separate, which is, I don't know if that's normal for writers, but I don't know. Yeah, it's a very odd sort of sensation.
You mentioned process. I know there's a lot of writers and a lot of readers in the audience tonight, and so I want to ask about that because your books are so beautifully constructed. It almost feels fractal, like the construction of each sentence then goes into the construction of each section, into the work as a whole. And speaking of new work, I was listening to a podcast that you've done with Val Howlett, who I think it's okay to say is also your partner, where you were talking about a story about the first tigers in the US, something we can come back to. But you mentioned that you love putting together furniture, and Val says you love a structural puzzle. And it just really, I was like, yes, that is the perfect to describe how intricately your stories function. Some of them are written through as narratives, some of them, like Inventory, take these other more experimental forms. So how do you do it? What's the secret? Do you start with the form, the voice? Is it different for different stories?
I think thinking of it as a puzzle was actually probably the most accurate way for me, I think, to approach structure. I mean, I think that it's like stories don't have single solutions, right? Like if you gave a sort of scenario or a plot to 3 different writers, they would come up with 3 different solutions to like tell the kind of story they want to tell. But there are things that work and things that don't. And so I feel like a lot of writing is having a concept or an idea or a thought, and it's sort of like in your mind, it's like you're envisioning like a thing, like, I guess if you want to think about the furniture analogy, it's like there's like a photo of the finished product and okay, this is what it's supposed to look like. You have this like disassembled thing in front of you. You're like, all right, now I got to get it close. And so that's kind of like more of a technical sort of way of thinking about it. But I also feel like part of it is sort of like this idea of like you imagine a horse brain and you can like visualize a horse really clearly, and then you draw it and it's like a circle with like stick legs and like a little circle head, and you're like, that doesn't look anything like a horse. And it's like you're trying to get the thing that you're doing close to the thing that's in your mind, and that's like the process. And so in some ways it is a puzzle. It's like trying to figure out how to best sort of execute something. I mean, there's a story in my first collection that I remember being really sort of flummoxed by, and it took me, it was this story 8 Bites, which is a story about a woman who has weight loss surgery and is haunted by the ghost of her body. But the first early sort of drafts of that story were from the perspective of her daughter, who's basically me. And the story just wasn't working. And I think it was because I was too close to the POV, and it took me thinking, oh, what if I told the story from the perspective of the mother figure, like the woman who actually is making these choices, like how would that change it? And it just like unlocked the whole story for me. So yeah, so I feel like there is this like, and I don't know, I guess it is like a piece of a puzzle that you have to kind of solve. And I find that very pleasurable. Like my dad was an engineer, I don't know. So I find that thing very, very useful, I guess.
My brain has just completely stopped on the phrase haunted by the ghost of her body. And it's just embracing that and like wanting to write, a whole dissertation on it and its place in your work. And it, also makes me think about, in the dream house and the idea of being haunted by these structures, the structure of the body, the structure of the house, the structure of the story, the folktale itself. And, my brain as a feminist film scholar particularly goes to that shout out to Marianne Doan's work on the women's film as this haunted house and ghost stories, horror, this genre that on the one hand is all about like torturing and breaking women down. You talk about the film Gaslight, its many iterations in particular, and yet it's so compelling. I think particularly for us as queer people, like there are places to get into it and open it up and then rewrite it. And I'm really fascinated by that like dual relationship to genre in your work. Like, yes, I want to be in this place of like working with these genres that are seen as not acceptable in literary fiction, but also like breaking down how they've kind of subjected the bodies of people of marginalized genders and sexualities to sort of horrors and torture. So yeah, genre.
Well, I feel like
ghost.
Horror, I feel like horror in particular, and you know, gothic, which is sort of horror through like a lens of domesticity or a lens of structure, like physical structure, like a house. And other sort of genres of horror, there is this like push and pull relationship where they both have been used in very sort of paradigm affirming ways, and they also can be really subversive in really interesting ways. And I think to me, it's the genre that sort of offers the most, even while being very risky in a lot of ways. Like because it involves so much sort of heightened emotional. There's so many heightened emotional registers, I guess, in the genre, which is like risky and is like, you know, tricky to pull off well. But it's also the genre that offers me the most like psychologically. Like I find it the most sort of compelling. And I think that there's something, I mean, specifically about the gothic, which is like, you know, about women being haunted by buildings and the domestic and like the women's role or femme people's role sort of in the domestic sphere and like historically how that sort of played out. So like there's this short story I really love from like the mid 19th century called A Jury of Her Peers by Susan Glaspell, who was an American writer. And it's the story about this woman has committed a crime. She's murdered her husband, and the sheriff brings his wife and some other women to the house to gather some things for this lady who's sitting in jail. And the women are all sort of gathered in the kitchen and talking about this crime that may or may not have been committed. And the men are sort of wandering the house being like, ho, 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 look at the women. They're just standing in the kitchen. And they're sort of moving around and like trying to, you know, do men's work. And the women standing in the kitchen basically solve the crime. Like they figure out like what had happened. Like this woman had a songbird, and the husband had strangled the songbird, and so she had strangled the husband. And there's all these sort of things about domesticity and being trapped and freedom being sort of taken away. And in the end, the women choose not to report her. They conceal the bird. Like one of them conceals it in her apron, and they decide not to say anything to the men. And it's literally this story about like this space, like the domestic being like this space of like sort of empowerment and strength and safety and also extreme danger. And it's like weird because it's not really about a haunted house, but it is, because they're just literally standing in one room and like they don't move from this one space the entire time. And it just feels like hauntings are just such a really useful way of thinking about character and plot and things like gender and sexuality and these like people on the margins. It's like they're basically ghosts already. So, you know, it just feels like a really smart way to think of, or like a useful way to think about that thing.
And something about that, I guess, the story that you're talking about makes me think of the place of like history and memory in your work, how you're also digging into these hidden histories, because I think I'm right in saying at the time that story was written, women couldn't serve on juries, like they were not considered legally competent people. So it's like this incredible moment of a story writing into history, even of its own moment, something that couldn't exist, and now you're giving it to us, a history. Like I hadn't come across that story before. And at the same time as there's this push and pull around horror and genre, there's a push and pull around another return of the repressed in your work, which is the archive. Like archival documents, but also like you shout out to Saidiya Hartman, who you also cite in your list of top 5 books that you so generously made for us, and the idea of archival silences. So, you know, on the podcast, you were talking about like newspaper sources, archival sources, then there's archival silences, and then there's this like other incredible archive in both of your books and in The Dark Woods, which is your comic, which is folk tales, like the unwritten archive, or predominantly oral, until it gets, written down by the white dude, like the Brothers Grimm and whatever. So like memory, history, what do we do with it? It feels like that's really central to your work. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think any person who exists in the margins, and I think that can be women, people of color, queer people, genderqueer people, like people who exist sort of at odds with themselves or their society, and sort of have historically. I think it's really important to think about ways to convey that knowledge. So there's actually this really great, so I'm just gonna recommending a bunch of short stories. There's this this writer I love, Sophia Samatar. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she's this really brilliant American writer. And she has this gorgeous short story called Ogres of East Africa that's about a man who in East Africa who is keeping these notes for his colonial sort of employer, this like old white man who can't really see, and he's like keeping these notes about ogres. And the story is sort of being told in the literal margins of these like tales of ogres. And so it's like this sort of tension and push and pull between oral histories and written histories, and like who gets to commit things where, and like where the stories come from. And so yeah, like I'm very interested in like stories that don't get told and why. And I mean, it's funny because it's one of those things where I think it's a thought that I've always sort of had. And then when I was researching stuff for my memoir, I came across Saidiya Hartman's work, and of course there was like, oh, there's this entire like critical framework that I didn't even know about for this whole idea of like, there are pieces missing, and like how do we restore them, and like how do we sort of make right the wrongs of the past, even just in terms of the stories that are told or the narratives that are committed to the page. And yeah, certainly like oral histories, folk tales, are ways of, I think, accessing that. And I mean, it's weird because I think even in a contemporary sense, like, I mean, I don't know sort of the arc of like, Me Too stuff in the UK, but like, in the US, I feel like there's a lot of talk about things like whisper networks and like what it means to have like informal stories that like are sort of passed from person to person that like sort of bolster official things. And there's like this gap between like stuff that can be legally acted on, stories that are committed to the page, things that can be sort of fact checked. And then there's like this like other piece of it that's like this entire sort of support structure that like is giving strength and purpose and support to other people, but doesn't exist in this like official capacity. And so I feel like it's just this really sort of rich way of thinking about, and I also just feel like there's something really interesting about when people say things like this is new or this has never happened before, like what that means. Like I think a lot about the sexuality, the archive of sexuality that the Nazis burned in the 30s. That was like sort of this, for those of you who don't know, this like just a huge archive of like transgender and queer studies that existed in Germany in the early part of the 20th century, and was just burned by the Nazis. And so when people say things like, oh, transness is new, like it's just invented, it's like a modern trend, it's like, oh no, like people burned, like it was an archive and people burned it because they didn't agree with it, they destroyed it. And so I just think there's something really like it is the act of destroying an archive can be incredibly damaging and incredibly harmful, and the act of restoring it or like trying to sort of imagine the spaces in between can be really restorative and powerful, I think.
I just want to really embarrass myself by saying that that moment of burning the archive is where my book, A Nazi Word for a Nazi Thing, begins. And just how powerful it is to hear you describing it and paralleling it with the work that you're doing and that Saidiya Hartman is doing. It does, and Me Too is like a very loose way of framing it, but this does feel like a moment where those archives are being re-recognized. We're giving ourselves a history, and it's so important. And one of the histories that you attend to, there was a quote that really stood out to me. It's in your amazing reading of Alain Gouradi's The Stranger by the Lake. Is, quote, the idea that queer does not equal good or pure or right, that this is such an important part of recovering these archives as well, that there's this kind of double bind of being a quote unquote model minority or being minoritized, that either you don't exist, you can't appear, or you can only appear on the terms of the mainstream, which are that you have to be perfect. Yeah. And if you're not perfect, you have to be perfect. So all the other, as you say, nuanced, complex stories are what get erased. And at the same time, In the Dream House is a memoir looking at a difficult story. It's not about making excuses for abuse, violence in queer relationships. So how do we tell those full stories in a world that is so judgmental? Like, that very much feels like a question behind, how did you take that step to do that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's weird because I feel like part of the problem, or part of the solution, is that, I mean, certainly I feel like people of a progressive sort of political bent, you know, we think of, I guess, more conservative people as our enemies in many ways, and they are in many ways, you know. So like, I have a lot of contempt for homophobes and transphobes, like in my government and in my community, and like that's, you know, that piece of it. But I also think there's a piece of it that's like, there are also a lot of well-intentioned white people, well-intentioned straight people, well-intentioned cis people who like don't understand the damage that they're capable of doing and aren't really willing to listen because they consider themselves to be on the right side of history. There's this sense of smugness, I guess you could call it, and sureness. And I think one of the hard things, both, you know, I feel this way about Me Too, I feel this way about the content of my book, whereas like there's this, you know, reconcile, where I'm like, I already know that, like, you know, homophobes are my enemy, whatever, like that, you know, and that's like sort of just, it goes without saying. But I feel like the more complicated thing is like, what do you do with people who are ostensibly your allies, who ostensibly have the same values in politics as you, who are working against you and working against people in your community? And like, what do you do about that? And how do you convince people who think that they're right, that they're not, and that their politics, their values are actually contradicting each other? And I don't really know the answer to that question, like, unfortunately. Like, I feel like that's, I mean, in the US, I feel like this is sort of the contradiction of like all of our, this is why we keep ending up with these like really milquetoast sort of middle of the road Democratic presidential candidates, which is just like, you know, it's like, that's not, I mean, it's like, I voted for, you know, Joe Biden, but it's not who I would have chosen. And like, I feel like we really love to cater to this sort of good white, good straight, good cis sensibility that believes itself to be correct, and I think to our detriment. And I think honestly, it makes me a little cynical about the world. Like, I feel like ultimately, I did an event years ago and I was saying something like this, and afterwards this lady came to me and she was like, "You're so young to feel that way. Are you in therapy?" And I was like, I am in therapy, but I feel like also I have this perspective where it's like, I don't think that people who are in power have incentives to give it up. And so I feel like, you know, small scale change is possible. And I think that like individually people's lives can be improved. But I also think that there's this fighting, this uphill battle that's being fought that I feel like is really difficult, where it's like men, white people, cis people, straight people, I don't feel like giving up the power that they've accrued. They have no reason to, and they don't really want to. And I feel very cynical about that, unfortunately, which I feel terrible. I really wish, I hope I'm wrong. I hate saying that out loud. I don't know. I don't know.
I feel like you're 100% right. So maybe I'm also really old and cynical.
In therapy, I guess. I mean, I am.
And also, you know, queer. Like, and it makes me think like the one of the many sort of comrades that you mention in the Dream House, who are people who sort of effectively stood by your side as writers and artists, is Dorothy Allison, who is, you know, was a writer that I happened across as a teenager. Like, I didn't grow up with a lot of queer culture, but that's what what independent bookshops can do. Let's say that. I saw her book in a window, Skin, which is a book of essays about sex, race, and class. And really about class in a way that a lot of writing is not. And it blew my mind. My campaign for Serpent's Tale to publish it in the UK, where it's never been published, has already begun.
Oh, wow. Oh my, I didn't realize. Has any of her work been published there? Or?
Yeah, Busted Out of Carolina is still in print, and you can get copies of 2 or 3 things, I know for sure. So everyone do that if you haven't. But Skin is the mind blower. And so I wanted to, you know, just be so overwhelmed by seeing her work mentioned, because I feel like the kind of milquetoast forces that you mention are one of the reasons why a writer that powerful and that passionate and that like hitting, you know, on the head, I was going to say straight, but absolutely not isn't talked about. And I feel like one of the reasons is she writes about sex. Like she talks about teaching this erotic writing workshop where she gets the queer women in her class to write about having oral sex with their mothers, like in a consensual scenario. And I feel like, you know, not parallel, but you're writing like sex as part of one of the pleasures of your writing. And you write about it with such attention and variety and thought, like it's always doing something about memory, about the body, about feeling. And like, tell us repressed British people, how not everyone who is in the audience is as affected by being brought up in the British education system as I am, but please rescue us.
I mean, I also will say that like Americans are shockingly Puritan. I mean, I guess not shockingly, like Puritans are literally the backbone of our like history. The author of Skin is Dorothy Allison. Sorry, someone just asked in the comments. She's wonderful. She's this queer American writer. She wrote a lot about like class and queerness, and she is really Bastard Out of Carolina is like, I mean, that's probably her most famous book, I'd say, but she's wonderful. Highly recommend her. But yeah, so I feel like Americans also, I mean, I'm literally in the middle of, there's this fight happening in Texas where like a school had added my book to a list and parents have been fighting to remove it from the list. And this woman literally brought a dildo to a school board meeting and like brandished it while reading from the memoir, and like slammed it down on the table. It was like, this is what they're asking our children to read. Like the dildo was the thing they were asking the children to read. And yeah, it was really weird. Or it was like a strap on, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, it was very strange. But so yeah, so Americans are also deeply puritanical. And I feel like writing about sex has always been super important to me. And is like weirdly one of the most like controversial. I get asked probably more about writing sex than I get asked about almost anything else, which I find very interesting. And I think for me, you know, sex feels so central to the human experience, and it seems silly to think of it as somehow separate or different and only something you can sort of gesture at or allude to or omit altogether, when in fact it's like, you know, I mean, for most people it's like a very central part, like sex and sexual desire like is a very central part of one's life. And so to me it feels like anything you like, you know, the same way you'd write about food, like why would, you know, it's just a really important thing that like is worth giving time to and worth thinking about and is like psychologically really relevant to like characters and people's experiences. And I mean both for my characters and also for myself, and like for the memoir, like sex was a big part of it. You know, it was like, what does it mean to be like a young fat queer woman who like hasn't had a ton of experience with women, who like is suddenly like head over heels in love and in lust, and like how do you manage that, and how do you like come back from that when that's like this powerful thing sort of pulling at you from one direction. And so yeah, to me it feels like very critical. And I also feel like, you know, men get to write about sex all the time and I feel like no one really questions it, like straight men especially. And you know, like I remember like when I at some point like asking like I want to read like women writing about sex, and like, you know, there are women who do it absolutely, and a lot of like queer people, but it just feels like a lot of the men who get really famous for writing about sex, people who get famous for writing about sex like Philip Roth are just all men, you know. And I think that we, you know, there's sexism and homophobia and all kinds of things at work why we don't value women's sex writing as much as we do men's. But yeah, I don't know. To me, and also like they're fun to write. It's fun to write a sex scene. Like it's fun to think about. It's fun to like, it's sort of like, I don't know. I always give this advice in my classes when I teach fiction. I tell my students, if you're feeling sort of stuck and you don't know what to do, throw a party in the story, because, you know, a party is this, you know, way of like bringing characters together and like encouraging bad behavior, like horny behavior and drugs and alcohol and like craziness and music and dancing and physicality. And it's like this just kind of good way to like sort of sort of peel away layers of characters. And I feel like a sex scene is actually really similar, where you're getting this moment of like vulnerability and desire that can be like really sort of instructive and really potent. So yeah.
There's another aspect of life that shows up a lot in your writing, which is like screen media, film and TV. Like obviously our lives are super saturated. We're literally on screens right now. And I feel like I should also say that 2 of the stories in Her Body and Other Parties are also about epidemics. Of one kind or another. Although in Inventory, the character says that it turns out the one thing people didn't want during an epidemic was advice on taking quirky photos, which weirdly turned out not to be true.
No, right?
It's what everyone, please help me with my Insta feed. And like she would have been so busy.
Having now lived through a pandemic, there are definitely some details. I wouldn't change like the core of Inventory, but I feel like I want to like rewrite it kind of, because I'm like some of the things, you know, having just written from my mind, I'm like, oh, I actually would change some stuff now that I've actually.
Well, you know, as booksellers, we have to inventory every year, so there could be a kind of Inventory 2.0. But right. And maybe it's like my own totally nerdy persuasion, but I love reading like good, great writing about film and television. And I particularly love the way that you literally incorporate it. Like what you're writing about is how we carry it in our bodies, how it shapes our bodies, and like how it's made of our bodies. So, like the standout for a lot of people I know is Especially Heinous, which creates this double alternate narrative of the show Law and Order SVU. Is it 277?
272.
272 episodes, like this absolutely incredible structural undertaking. It's like an epic poem. It's like Dante's Law and Order SVU or something. But then throughout in the Dream House, there's these moments where like film and television are somewhere that you sort of refined. It's almost like you said about the polity, but like the other way, it's like this moment of connection or grounding or reflection, connection, ways of being. And so I wanted to just get into that a bit with you, like the importance of film and television, like not just, oh, well, it's everywhere in our culture, but particularly how it can give us our bodies. Like it's not just this disembodying thing. Like what's happening for you?
Yeah, well, I think, so I actually studied photography in college. So it's weird because I come to writing through, I've written my whole life, but I sort of came to writing through this sort of more visual medium. And I think part of the reason I'm so interested in it is because that was a thing that I did for a long time. And I was really interested in sort of the language of film and of images and like how sort of visual language can translate, I guess. And it's weird because it's like as somebody who like reads a lot of books and watches a lot of movies and like sees a lot of adaptations, it's like it's such an interesting thing to me, like the project of adapting a book, because the language of film is so different and the way that you interact with a film is so different. So I actually recently just rewatched, which I hadn't seen in years, the Talented Mr. Ripley, the film from the 90s, and I also had read the book, the novel, and I was like, and it felt to me a lot like The Shining, where it's both a really good novel and a really good film, but they're like completely unrelated to each other. Like they feel like just totally different expressions of the same story. It's like giving 2 different artists the same tale and like seeing what they do with it. And part of the reason for that is that there's not really interiority in a film. Like you're sort of required to sort of demonstrate things visually, which like really adds, and I'm a pretty like interior writer. So like when I think a lot about, like I am like working on a script right now, and it's really hard because like you're having to like think about things in this sort of more visual way and sort of demonstrative way, which is really different than just like talking through someone's interiority, right? And yeah, so I feel like for me, there's something with a language of film, and I feel like they can sort of teach each other things. So like, I remember, like, actually, it's funny you mentioned Inventory before, but one of the films that actually was really very influential in thinking about that story was Children of Men, which is like a movie that I really, really love, which if y'all haven't seen it, you really should. It's a really great movie. And it's based on a novel. But the film is really interesting because so much of the world building of the film, because it's sort of this post-apocalyptic, it actually takes place in the UK, for those of you who haven't seen it. And it's the UK many years into this epidemic where women have stopped having babies. So like the youngest person in the world is like 18 or something. And there's like terrorist attacks and like immigrants being brought into the UK are being like held in cages. And it's like this really intense sort of, and then the sort of the crux of the story is that then they discover a pregnant woman who is pregnant, who's the first pregnant woman they've seen in a really long time. And so the thing with this film, though, is that so much of the world building is happening in the background. And the film is like, there's a story happening in the front, but there's these moments with the camera, like your eye can sort of drift and like you can get information from the background that you also could miss, And I've seen this movie like, I don't even know, 20 times more. And every time I watch it, I see something new happening in the background in like the graffiti or the advertisements, or like the camera is just sort of moving and you're like, this is a brief detail where you're like, it's actually telling you so much, but you have to see it and like sort of register it to understand what it means. And so I feel like when I wrote Inventory, I was thinking a lot about foregrounding and backgrounding and how, whenever there's a tragedy, and again, I wrote this before COVID, but like, every time there's COVID or every time there's a pandemic, but like COVID's a great example, is like, there's, this massive, like devastating, destructive, painful, awful human loss happening on this global scale, right? And then you have people being like, I'm bored out of my fucking mind. I'm trapped in my house. I'm losing my mind. And like both of those things are real. Like it's real to say like, I'm really bored being in my house and not being able to see people. And it's also really real being like millions of people are dying and it's horrible. And like the human toll is catastrophic. And like, that is just the existence. Like every time you make yourself some breakfast, somebody's being blown up in some other part of the world. And like that, or maybe in your part of the world. And like, that's just the reality of the human condition, is like there's always something kind of small and human happening while something huge and terrible is happening. And like how do you sort of, and like and by like sort of adjusting the focus or like shifting the registers, you can sort of move back and forth. And so Inventory is, this woman like going through this like weird sort of period of her life, like her slut phase, which I feel like a lot of us go through and very recognizable, but also is doing so against this backdrop of like this sort of catastrophic loss and pain and illness, and how do those things sort of impact each other. And so I feel like the thing about film, sort of the visual medium, that like it is just really interesting. And then of course, especially Heinous is sort of the opposite, where I'm taking like a show and like imagining like the weird interiority and like things that are like impossible to film, that would be impossible to explain in the show itself. So it's like a weird night. But I also watch a lot of TV. I play a lot of video games, watch a lot of movies. Like I'm really interested in like those sorts of mediums and how they tell us about how they're sort of their art. I don't know. So
I can see a great discussion happening in the chat about favorite stories from Her Body and Other Parties, with shout outs for Real Women Have Bodies, for especially Heinous, for Inventory. Hopefully we're going to get all of them. We've just got our first question from Libby J. So Libby, I hope it's okay. I'm going to read your question and encourage other people to share them as well. And your t-shirt slogans, don't forget. So Libby asks, to what extent do you see writing queer female sexual experiences as a form of activism?
Oh man, I'm going to give a very frustrating answer, which is a lot and not at all. So on one hand, obviously the choice of what to write is political inherently. I think maybe what's more accurate is I think the question is actually more for like publishers, where it's like, to what extent do you feel like publishing queer female sexual experiences is a form of activism? And because I feel like for writing also, it's like, I'm just writing about I'm not exclusively writing about myself. I'm a fiction writer, primarily, except for my memoir. But like, I am really interested in putting giving space to experiences that I don't see a lot in writing, and it's like really important to me to do that. And so in a way, it's like not just my life, it's not activism. It's just like me talking about my experiences. But I think that the act of publishing that work and sort of centering it and bringing it to the public, which is like what publishers do, and bookstores and like the people who are sort of in between like the public and the artist, that is also its own kind of activism, right? Which is like making those works available.
And Kavya Murti says, I think this is something many of us share, that your book In the Dream House felt like a song in which I recognized something about myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I love that phrasing of the song, like this thing that haunts you, that you almost think, I've heard this before. This must have always existed because I always needed it.
Yeah.
It has that deep connection to culture, just through that incredible use you make of the folktale tropes, but as I said, the precision of the writing. And so we had a question from Coco Star, which I think kind of relates to this, maybe deep source. So Coco asks, what books and stories had an impact on you growing up? And I wanted to add that when I first read Her Body and Other Parties, it like fit onto this shelf in my head, which is like, the books that blow the top of your head off. And a lot of them are the ones you read when you're young. And particularly for me, I would put it next to like Angela Carter's Black Venus and the closing story, The Fall River Axe Murders, which your mention of Lisa Duggan's book, Sapphic Slashes, made me think about. And I recently learned the original title for that story was Mise en Scène for a Parasite. So yeah, I don't know if Angela Carter was one of yours, but so who were they? Who were the writers that got in there?
I actually read Angela Carter weirdly late. People always assume, and it's like she was very formative for me, as was like Shirley Jackson, but I came to them as an adult. Like I didn't come to them as a young person. I mean, the writers who I read when I was really young who really spoke to me, Ray Bradbury was one of them. I read like a lot of his short stories when I was really little, which I feel like were these very sort of like conceptual sort of exercises in this really interesting way. And then I really loved a lot of sort of absurdist literature. So I really loved, like, I don't know if you guys have the Wayside School books by Louis Sekar. Is that like I don't know if those were published in the UK. He's like this absurdist writer. He wrote, and there were these like weird little stories at the school, and each chapter is like a different little sort of independent story, that it's like this whole story. There's like a weird school where weird things happen. And those books were really important to me. I read 100 Years of Solitude when I was in high school, and that was really important to me. So yeah, it was both like a lot of like, it was like children's work or young adult work that was very sort of experimental and strange and surreal. And then also like adult books that, V.C. Andrews, like Flowers in the Attic, which was also very special to me. It was like a very weird book and very sexual. And I read it way too young, but it ended up being, that's in terms of like the gothic. My father had a lot of, what's his name? Not Tom Clancy. The guy who wrote Jurassic Park and the Andromeda. Michael Crichton. Yes. Lots of Michael Crichton. Like that was like a, like a sort of early sci-fi. So I just feel like it was like just like weird books. And I was one of those kids who was very like indiscriminate as a reader. Like I would just sort of go to the library, and my mom bought me, I had like a tote bag. I actually still have it from my library. And I was only allowed to check out as many books as fit in the tote bag. So that was her rule. So I would literally just go, and I would like moving through like alphabetically, and I would just like pull books off the shelf and read them. And then once I like reached the end of the YA section, I was like, all right, guess I'm going to adults now, which is how I ended up reading a lot of other books that were not appropriate for me at the time, but were also very formative for me. So
yeah, the importance of the literal carrier bag of fiction cannot be overstressed. We do have some gorgeous Serpent's Tail indie bookstore week tote bags in store for those of you in London. So, do come and grab them. We have so many amazing questions. I wish I'd shut up much earlier. So I hope it's okay with people. I'm gonna like put them together because I think some of them fit together. So we have a couple of questions about writing from your own life and making choices about what information you share with other people. That's from Gray. And then Gulnush says, in the dream house is truly daring and beautiful. How do you manage to protect your privacy after writing such an intensely intimate and personal book? So that is super successful. I should definitely add that bit. So both bits of like, how do you get into it? And then how, like, what's the dismount?
So in terms of like deciding what to write or what to include, I mean, the first draft of the book, or like, there's a lot of stuff in the book that isn't there anymore that like I had sort of put in and eventually took out for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are craft reasons, some of them are like sort of, concerns of other kinds. But I do think that I sort of the philosophy that if a thing happened to you, it is your right to write about it or talk about it, because it had to do with you. I feel less certain about talking about like private things that happen to other people that like have nothing to do with you, which, I think is, and I think this is a question that like all essayists and also even, I mean, novelists, I feel like when it's fiction, it's fair game. But like with nonfiction, it's like, yeah, there's like this question of like, how do you talk about things? And there's also just like a practical question of like, do you feel like, are you worried that someone will be mad at you? And for me, like, I wasn't like, I wrote about some relatives and I was like, not super concerned what they had to say about it. I was kind of like, whatever, and like, I feel like there's just this piece of it where I was like, I had to make decisions about who I talked about and how I thought they would react to it and how they would like burn any bridges, but I sort of went through that process and had to make that decision. And so I think the question, I think it's also okay to write whatever you want. And then I think you have to just ask yourself questions about what could this sort of impact, like how could this impact my life or the life of the people around me or the relationships that I have with the people who I'm writing about. I think this comes up a lot with the people who write about like their parents, for example, where it's like, am I worried about how that's going to look? I mean, like, there's no correct answer. I think it's like everyone's sort of comfort level. And then the question about privacy, I mean, I think it's important to remember that even when somebody has written a really intimate and personal book that like you actually don't know them, like you know more things about them than like somebody who's never read the book, but you also only know like a kind of a limited amount. And so for me, I mean, yeah, like, I mean, I'm sort of at the point where right now I'm doing a lot of press because my book is coming out in a bunch of languages and a bunch of other countries. And so I'm still like doing interviews and stuff. And my plan is like, once that's sort of over, to just not talk about this book anymore. Like to be, to be like, I'm sort of just putting like, I'll happily talk about whatever else people want, but I do find it very, no, I'm not saying this. I mean, I do it all the time. I'm at the point where I'm sort of, sorry, I just feel like I like to preface that. It's like, I just am at the point where I'm like, at some point I'm going to be done and I'm going to like, be like, that's that, because I just feel like I can only talk about it so much and I only have so much to say about it. And I think that's part of it too, is protecting just that part of myself. Because it is really hard to like, I mean, go on a computer or be at an event and be talking about like the worst thing that ever happened to you with strangers, or even worse, people that know you that didn't know that happened to you. Right. And so it's a really like odd dynamic that's really hard to pin down. And honestly, I find I'm very much in admiration of nonfiction writers. I have no idea how they do it. Like people who write more than one book like this, like I'm just like, I will never do this again. Like I'm like done with nonfiction forever, fiction all the way. Bring me like weird horror. I just want to do like fiction because like honestly talking about nonfiction and writing nonfiction is so hard and so brutal and personal. So I mean, you have to kind of maintain a sense of boundaries and a sense of space because it is like so weird to have that sort of stuff in the world.
And we have a question that I feel like in some way relates to this, and it's something that I also really noticed about reading In the Dream House and was really moved by as someone who writes nonfiction and often writes it quite recursively, which is about. So this is from ER, and it asks, I don't know if it's the TV show joining us or not, but ER asks, to what extent did the form of writing in the Dream House supposedly addressed to yourself serve the process and result of writing? And I think for me, that's about both using the second person address, but also the moments in the book where the narrator reflexively speaks about having written. Going to write. So there's a story, The Resident, in Her Body and Other Parties, that is about writing and about writing residencies. And that shows up in the Dream House as well. These moments of like writing about writing, like this, as you say, this completely weird thing that is like compulsive and exposing and soothing. Like, it talks about all of that. So was that something that was always there through it, or was that something that you added while editing? Like, where in the process did that voice come?
I mean, I wrote a lot of those pieces in real time. So like, I was at various residencies and was sort of picking away at this project like over the course of many years. And so it made sense to me that, I would sort of end like, it's, at some point I was like, maybe I won't ever use these. And like, even in the beginning, I remember my editor bought the book. And we worked together before. My first book, my editor was like, well, maybe we'll cut these out. I don't know. And I feel like there's like a weird, I don't know if you call it a stereotype or like a weird idea. People get really exasperated about writers writing about writing, which I guess I understand if you're not a writer, you're like, why do I care? But like, I care. Like, I'd love to hear people writing about the process of writing because it is this alchemy. It's like, what is happening to translate something from your experience or your brain onto the page? And like, what does that look like? And I think that's actually like a deeply interesting question. And I'm always here for that process. I think also part of it was like, because there is this sort of simultaneous reflection happening like across time in this book. And, you know, I mean, I'm speaking to like the young version of myself, like the almost like pre-gay version of myself, and also like the version of myself going through this experience, and the version of myself right afterwards. And like, I can do that from my perch, like me in the present day, but they can't do it in the other direction. Like, you know, my young self doesn't know about myself in my early 20s. My early 20s self does not know about the breakup person does not know about me today. And like, so it's like this weird dynamic where you can like only sort of travel backwards and like have knowledge from the present that like, that you can't have in the past. And I think that that's a really interesting way. And ultimately, I think that's what all memoir writing is basically. Like, you're always in conversation, and even all writing, like you're in conversation with yourself in some way, and like in conversation, especially with memoir or nonfiction, with like a past version of yourself, maybe even a dead version of yourself that like exists on some other plane. And like, I think that's where that, and that process, again, sometimes you don't necessarily see it, you know, in the final version, but that's what you're doing. That's what's happening. And so I feel like for me, that question of conversation and of like thinking about like, what does it mean to be like sitting down and like, this is the thing I'm trying to like, I'm like sitting in a chair, you know, in the woods or across like from like a dried up lake. And like, I'm just like digging into this like piece of myself that I haven't thought about in a long time. And like, what does that look like? And what does that mean? And why does that matter? And so, yeah, so to me, it just seemed like, and then it is funny because like, as we kept going, my editor was eventually like, okay, I think we're going to keep these. I actually really like them. Like, I feel like it came around. I also feel like I don't know. I feel like as a writer, I do a lot of things where I'm just like, people are like, I don't know if that's going to work. And then they're like, it kind of works. All right, we'll let you do it. You know, like, I feel like I do that all the time.
As they damn well should. We've got a couple of other questions about process and elements of the story, and I'm just thinking about that idea, like it's such a sort of common idea of writing to a version of yourself that is dead on another plane. Like, definitely write that story. I mean, you have, but you know, characterize it. So there's a question from Sandra D about using body horror in your writing and the corporeal, why it's so important. And I feel like I want to pair that with another really great question that gives a specific example of that, which is the first story in Her Body and Other Parties, The Husband Stitch. And it says, this is from Christina Carty, who says, the myths married the main story so perfectly. Did you start with any of those in mind, or did they come to you as you developed the piece? So these two aspects of body horror and folktale, and how those piercing moments get situated in those stories and the writing. Where do you start with the narrative, or with the kind of, you said you're a photographer and your writing is so imagistic, those piercing images, is that where you start?
Yeah, so yes, I feel like a lot of my writing is very visual, and I think it is because I have this training and I do think of things very visually. I'm a very visual person. This sort of first question about body horror, I mean, I feel like body horror feels very similar to me in terms of the gothic, where it's like, instead of thinking about women in space, it's like thinking about the body as a source of fear, anxiety, degradation, abjection, you know. And so, and as somebody who, like, you know, my body exists at many peripheries also, like I'm sick, you know, like I'm a person who has like various sort of illnesses, and like, you know, and I'm aging like everybody does, right? And so you're constantly sort of being confronted with your body's limitations and your body's both limitations of the body itself and also limitations of it in society when people have certain ideas about the body that you possess. And so to me, body horror just feels like a way of accessing, like the same way that the gothic is a way of accessing us thinking about space and, or, you know, home. Body horror is a way of accessing those questions about the body. In interesting ways. So that, yeah, that's kind of why. That's like a genre that also really, or a subgenre of horror, I guess, that really interests me. And then the Husband Stitch, I mean, so actually the other myths in the Husband Stitch were actually one of the last things I added, which I think is like a weird little piece of trivia. So the first version of that story I wrote is basically the story as it exists without the stage directions and without the other urban legends. So it's just the woman with the green ribbon and her husband and like that story. And I wrote that part in like one sitting or like two sittings. Like it was like very quick. And I remember really liking it and being like, oh, this is like really interesting. It feels really special. It feels really like provocative, but it felt thin in this way that I didn't care for. Like I was like, there's something missing. There's like a dimensionality missing. It's not done. And what I ended up doing was returning to, so the author of, so I don't know if you guys, Alvin Schwartz, if you guys had that in the UK, but so there's this American folklorist who's dead now, but he named Alvin Schwartz, and he wrote or collected folklore for children throughout sort of the 80s and 90s, and I think 70s, 80s, and 90s. And there's this really iconic book of his called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And it's a trilogy. It's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and something else. And they had these like really terrifying illustrations, these like really iconic like watercolor illustrations. And I feel like kids, they're like a generation of kids like at my generation who were just like scarred for life by these books, but also loved them. And they were like banned constantly because they would be like in children's book sections of children's bookstores, and or like would be in the children's section of a bookstore, or they'd be like at school book festivals or whatever. And parents would like freak out because they were just like really gruesome illustrations. And they were just like basically rewritten urban legends for children. And he also had another book called In a Dark, Dark Room, which is where I read the version of the Green Ribbon story, which is a very old folk tale. Like he did not invent it. Washington Irving wrote a version of that story. They can sort of track it back to the American Revolution, or the French Revolution. There's this idea of like wearing a choker around the neck to indicate or conceal like a decapitated head. So this is like a very old story. But he wrote a version of it that had a green ribbon about this girl named Jenny who like marries this boy, and he was asking her about the ribbon, and then on their deathbed or her deathbed, she's like, fine, you can untie my ribbon, and he unties it and her head falls off. And it was like this really formative story for me. But anyway, so I when I was feeling a little stuck, I decided to dive back into the Alvin Schwartz book, the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark especially, and that had all the urban legends that ended up in the final version of The Husband Stitch, and had stage directions. And when I was a kid, I remember I was at Girl Scouts. I know you guys have like some version of scouting, but I was in Girl Scouts, and I was camping, and I was like reading from this book, and like the sort of stage direction is the end. It's the story from The Husband Stitch of the woman with the liver, where she eats the liver from a corpse, and the corpse comes in the night to like get its liver back. And it's like, who has my liver? Who has my liver? And then in the book, it says, you just grab the person closest to you and say, you have it. And that's what I did. And I made the girl cry hysterically. And I was like, whoa, stage directions are great. Like, really powerful. She was like super upset. I was like, gonna file that away for later. And then like, yeah, I was like, oh, I could do stage direction. That could be like super interesting. And I was like, oh, and these other urban legends also have their own way of being sort of converted and turned into like ways of thinking about things like questions about like gender, in like, especially in like heterosexual. I mean, it's a story about like heterosexuality as horror story, right? And so I feel like it's like there were all these ways in which the heterosexuality sort of fit, or the urban legends fit into this like question of like heterosexuality as horror story.
I love the way that you're telling that story as if you're telling us one of the short stories around a campfire, and I just love the voraciousness of the way that you've taken in all of these, you know, literally like eating all of these delicious sources and origin myths and made them into something of your own. And we actually have a question about this, and of course that story about the liver has made me think that for us in the UK it's dinner time. Let's do some delicious body horror. We've got a couple more questions that I'm gonna share, because I think they're really super fun. All these questions have been absolutely amazing. So this one has come from Lara Alonso Corona, who says the mention of LiveJournal in the Dream House had me revisiting my own old blog there. Were you very involved with fandom during that time? And did you write fanfic, brackets, hints of what, ? So let's put it all on the table here, you know, like let's get out our Buffy fanfic or X-Files stories, not confessing anything. What was going on there?
I was very active on LiveJournal. I did not write a lot of fanfic. Basically all of my friends did. Like, I feel like all my friends were fanfic writers, including a lot of friends who've become writers. Like, I remember following Cassie Clare back, you know, who obviously now is a very well-known, you know, following her back in the day. There were a lot of like fantasy writers and people who I was really interested in. I mostly used my LiveJournal to write about what I considered my sad life, my very depressing love life, my coming out. And it was sort of how I learned to write for an audience. So I feel like I actually like began to do I was more interested in like sort of, it's hard, I don't want to call them essays because they weren't really essays, but at some point I did have like a fairly robust readership that were not people that I knew in real life. And I remember like very sort of actively thinking about how do I talk about my experiences in a sort of a way that feels like sort of developed. It was like the first sort of, like experience writing for an audience, basically. So I didn't write a ton of fanfic. I didn't fully, like I liked it, but I feel like I was more interested in, like I feel like that instinct to like push beyond and past the story that exists. Like for me, it was like, I just want to read more books. Like I feel like my instinct was to like look for other books by the same writer. Like I had a sort of a different process, I guess. But I do feel like this idea of fanfic and this idea of like taking sort of literature that you have a lot of thoughts about and like sort of recreating it. I mean, that's what Especially Heinous is basically fan fiction, right? Or you think about like the history, you think about like, Wild Sagrasso Sea, which is like Jane Eyre fan fiction, right? Which is like, there's this piece of the story that's like unaddressed to me. And I'm really curious about like what happens when I like push into that. And that I find very, very interesting. And I've always loved sort of writers who have that instinct to like sort of retell stories in like really interesting ways and like think with the stories in like like a different capacity, I guess. So yeah, that's like a thing that really speaks to me. And yeah, but most of that journal was about me complaining about how no one would ever love me and I would die alone. Which I started when I was 15, so I was very morose. I was like a very, yeah.
100% not a Cassandra there, like definitely not a prediction. So we have one final question, which comes from a fellow bookstore, MF Books, and I hope it's okay to put this one, which is, how is Rosie Posey?
Yeah, she's good. It's raining here, and she's like me, that when it rains, she gets sleepy and she like takes long naps. So she's probably napping at this very moment. She's good. So for those of you who don't know, she's my geriatric beagle. I don't know. She's good. She just has a lot of needs. She's very insistent. She loves to like, when I'm writing on my computer on the couch, she loves to like flop her entire body over my computer, to so I don't forget that she exists and for 1 second, in any given part of the day. So she's very funny, very cute. Yeah, she's my little monster angel. I love her.
I mean, first of all, I feel like the gender of the day is geriatric beagle. And secondly, I'm going to be reading future of your stories, like looking for the sentence.
Right, yeah.
Rosie Posey accidentally. Right. So we've kept you for an hour, which feels like, the magical time in a story, after which we disappear. There's 2 great t-shirt slogans that have been suggested, and I think these would also work brilliantly as like graffiti stencils, because our cities and our spaces need to be filled with these words. So a suggestion from Nadia H, who suggests, from The Resident, "It is my right to reside in my own mind."
One of my favorites. I like that.
A great sentence. But I think also we want to hand over the crown. Galina S says they've never read a page that accurately described my experience with my family, so thank you. And the quote is, "A drama queen is nonetheless a queen." So we give you the crown, Carmen. Thank you for making this an incredible event, highlight of our year of Indie Bookshop Week, Pride Month, everything coming together. It's been so special. The comments are just reflecting your generosity, your incredible talent, and we're just so excited for what you do next.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's really lovely to have gotten all your wonderful questions, and I don't know, thanks for supporting indie bookstores.
Yes, so thank you to Burley Fisher and Sam Fisher for hosting this event. Thank you to Flora and Drew at Serpent's Tail, who made it possible for us to talk to Carmen, and to Serpent's Tail, who make it possible for us in the UK to read Carmen, to Grey Wolf in the US. And yeah, let's meet again for the next one. Let's do this around a campfire.
Yes.
All right. Good night, everyone, and happy Pride. And happy
Pride.
bookstores. Bye.